just a little bit of a fun question here. I don't know if you saw this article. I think it was a month or two ago, but I believe the head of global macro at Fidelity made a prediction that one Bitcoin is going to be worth something. I believe he said $1 billion by the year 2040. Which when I read that and I showed that article to some of my friends. I mean, they just almost fell out of their chair and just kind of laughed. But when I don't know if you saw that, did you by chance?
I didn't, but it's in line with other predictions I've heard. I mean, I'm not saying that's
Yeah.
the consensus view, um, but yeah, okay. I mean, look, let's
Is
let's
that
look at that on
nuts?
this.
What do you think? Is that totally
Well,
bonkers, or is there a chance?
let's look at the tree here, right?
Yeah.
If you add some rings to this, so the next ring that we're not at yet is 100,000 to a million. Then it would
Hmm.
be 1 to 10 million. So that's one
Yep.
ring. 10 to 100 would be ring number two, and 100 to 1 billion would be ring number three. Now, it does seem to me like a it would be very hard. It's hard to believe today that we could get to
Yeah.
those numbers,
Yeah.
but those predictions are not standing on top of nothing. They're standing on top of the history of an asset that since 2011 has gone from a penny to $70,000,
Right.
right? And
U.S.
so
Yeah.
that's the that so I have a lot of respect for people who publicly make a prediction that bold today.
Hmm.
um, I think this comes back to this idea of when the asset class is infinitely divisible, you just have to ask yourself how many new participants and new capital need to enter into this asset class in order to push it to those prices. And it's not when you think about it in those terms, not that hard to fathom. But listen, we're not in the business of giving price predictions on
No, neither am
Bitcoin,
I.
and
Yeah.
you're not
It's just for
either.
fun.
And
No, this is
and I
just for
think,
fun.
I enjoy those predictions. I certainly like to sit there and
Yeah.
think, what would the world be like?
Yeah. Well,
Um,
I
but
chuckled.
I exactly. I mean, it'll be it definitely is going to be front page news if that happens. But in the meantime, there are so many other great outcomes that don't require that kind of price
Sure.
appreciation.
Doesn't have
Um,
to go to
and
a billion.
but if it goes to a billion, I mean, oh boy,
Yeah, oh
look
boy,
out.
yeah. Yeah, that means, one Bitcoin will make you a billionaire, but nobody here is saying that's going to happen. I'm not saying it, and I know you're not saying it. It's just fun because it doesn't take long Googling and just going on YouTube that you start to, hear some of this stuff, and it's interesting, and we'll just have to wait and see. And it's
Yeah.
technically not even that far out. So, um, okay, so we're over an hour here, so we probably should get maybe towards the end and just wrap up. But just before we do, just as a couple points. Number one, if you can just talk about Bitcoin's portability, because we are increasingly living in a global world where um, you know, people might be from a certain country. They might get a second passport to another country. They might live in Canada, but have a place in Mexico and possibly another villa somewhere in Tuscany. Who knows? And in terms of moving funds or moving wealth, Bitcoin, kind of does something interesting, doesn't it? Where, like say you have a bunch of gold bars, it might be difficult to move gold bars from, say, Toronto to Mexico. But if you have at least some of your wealth on Bitcoin, you could theoretically even memorize the code. Not suggesting that's a good idea, but theoretically you could, and hop on a plane and go to any country you want and have some of your wealth with you. And there's really nothing else historically in the past, available like that one could do something like that with. So, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I had an experience about a year ago where I was trying to wire some money to South Africa. I wanted to buy a
Mhm.
book that was available, and
Right.
I needed to send a wire because they didn't take credit cards for this particular thing I was doing. And I went to my bank, and it took me about half an hour at the teller. The teller had to ask another teller to help put the wire in because it's very complicated, and it cost me $60 to wire less than $60 to South Africa. When you have that experience, you just
Yeah.
walk out of there saying, I wish they bookseller
Why?
would take Bitcoin, because then they
Yeah.
could just send me a QR code and they'd have my money in 10 minutes and it would cost me 20 cents and it would be done.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you also think about the system, right? And you think about the network of banks. Like international bank currency clearing is this kind of shadow world underneath the banking system of banks having accounts open with each other where they update their amounts that each bank owns of local currency at
Wire
other
transfers.
banks. All the wire transfers sit on top of that. So I'm not even getting to the point where you have a bag full of gold that you're trying to sit on a plane with, because we all know that's kind of absurd. How are you going to get through security, and it's heavy. But moving money around the world is difficult. It really is. The best money system we have for spending money when you're out of your home country these days is the credit card network, which is really an oligopoly of Visa, MasterCard, Amex.
Right.
That's kind of it. You have to go to relatively first world place. Your money never actually moves. They just are phoning home to your local bank to kind of put the charge through, essentially. But yeah, if you want to move somewhere, you actually want to transfer value at that point in time. There really is no way to do it today. With Bitcoin, you can do it today. And it's
takes some knowledge, but you could. Yeah.
You could, for sure.
Yeah.
And so the future that I see, Peter, is one where I think the initial wave of people using Bitcoin that's just starting now is going to be people using it as a store of value and an investment asset. And I think this wave is going to take us forward in Canada for the next 5 years or so. But what may happen is you may find that at some point, you have some Bitcoin in your investment account, part of your investment plan. Then you go on vacation. You go somewhere to the global south. You go to an emerging market. El Salvador has Bitcoin as legal tender, for example.
Yes.
Other countries are considering it. There are a lot of countries where, yeah, exactly. And there are countries where their local currency isn't very good, and they don't have good trust in their banks and financial institutions. And the merchants there may start to use Bitcoin because everybody has a phone. You can if you're a merchant in a country and you want to accept Bitcoin, you just set up a wallet, costs you nothing. You can have your stall somewhere and say, shoot me some Bitcoin, I'll sell you my products in Bitcoin. And you may find that the next experience with Bitcoin, after the experience of an investment asset, would be going on vacation to somewhere where they don't have good banking and they don't have good currency, and then having an opportunity to use actual Bitcoin. And that'll be a different experience because you'll have to go get real Bitcoin, and move it to a wallet on your phone and then spend it there. But that may be how this kind of comes about and comes to happen.
Okay. Just a couple more questions, and because you keep hearing this once in a while in the news or Bitcoin, but it's some financial guru says that, Bitcoin is going to zero. Now, I don't believe that to be the case, but I'm wondering if you can just quickly speak to that. Bitcoin is going to zero, says so-and-so on the news.
Yeah, so I think you do hear those quotes, and I think if it was going to happen, it would have happened already. I mean, going back to this slide, you see the price that's gone, up and down. Or here's the price in regular terms, okay, and since 2019. When you think about bubbles, they typically burst one time, and then the asset goes to zero, whatever the bubble is. You tend not to have bubbles that, burst and come back from the dead 4 times. I mean, it just doesn't. And also, it never went to zero. It's never. In fact, it rarely on the downturn goes back to pricing that it saw during the previous cycle. As we saw,
as you showed,
on a cycle basis,
right there,
it never happens.
Never happens.
Yes, there's volatility. Are there going to be people who say it's going to zero when the price drops? Sure, but
always,
people say all kinds of things, and I think that how many times does it have to not happen before it proves itself to be not a subject to those kinds of attacks? I mean, maybe another 2-3 cycles. At some point, people will stop saying that.
Yeah, they'll throw in the towel. And then another thing that keeps getting tossed around is the government will eventually ban Bitcoin. And if you can just speak to that, and especially in relation to the Canadian ETF approvals, like with Evolve, and then the SEC approvals in the US, where BlackRock, Fidelity, and so forth now have US approval, and how that's changed the likelihood of government banning Bitcoin.
Yeah, I think at this point it's virtually impossible because you can't have
Yeah,
approved products on an asset that then later governments say, well, that's not a legit
yeah,
asset.
that's what
I
I
just
see
don't
too.
think it. I don't think it's reasonable anymore. And listen, all the legislation is going towards adoption. One of the big catalysts for this year, I'll just show this really briefly, has been U.S. political sentiment shifting. It happened with Bitcoin ETFs in the U.S. in January, and
Mhm.
then last month, Donald Trump started to accept crypto as donations for his
Yes,
campaign.
interesting.
So did Joe Biden 2 weeks
Yeah.
later, although Joe Biden vetoed a pro crypto bill that had bipartisan support. So he doesn't know which way he's going at the moment. I'm not getting into that conversation.
No,
Um,
not
but
today.
that bill had support from Democrat leaders in the House and the Senate, Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi. Because what's happened is US politicians, and I think politicians around the world, are waking up to the fact that you either are pro Bitcoin or you're indifferent to Bitcoin. You're not
Hmm.
anti Bitcoin. If you don't own it because you don't like it as an investment, you don't care if somebody else likes it. I mean, think about how many thousands of stocks in the world you don't own. You're not
Correct.
mad that your friend or your neighbor has one of them and you don't have it. You're like, well, okay, fine, you have that, I have
Fine,
this, and
whatever.
that's it.
Yeah.
It's okay. And so there's only a voting block of people who want better regulations around crypto. There's no voting block of people who want no regulations or anti crypto regulations. And Donald Trump, it was announced today, will be speaking at Bitcoin Nashville, which is the biggest Bitcoin conference in the world that's happening later this month. So he's speaking there.
Hmm.
RFK Jr. spoke at that conference last year. Vivek Ramaswamy spoke at that conference last year. So did Senator Lummis from the US spoke there. Politicians are realizing there is political capital and there is real actual capital donations and so on that is directly tied to them becoming more pro crypto, more pro Bitcoin, and supporting sensible regulation to make the asset class safe for everybody to use in a regulated format like our ETFs. This is happening, and this is why we're not going backwards the other way, because it now becomes a political necessity to be sensible about crypto assets and not just put your head in the sand and say, I don't want to hear about it anymore, but to realize it's here to stay and we need good legislation around it. So it's coming. It's sped up faster this year than I expected. Um, and I think this is the beginning of a suite of new regulations around the world as other governments come to the table. And there's a question about should Bitcoin be a strategic asset for national reserves, right? Central banks own gold. Maybe
Agree with
they should
that.
own
Yes.
Bitcoin. And
Yeah.
back to the pie in the sky Bitcoin price predictions.
Yeah. Yeah.
Those kinds of ideas feed into that, right? Because
That's right.
if you start to see central banks saying, I need a strategic Bitcoin reserve, I don't know where the price goes because they're not going to
Yeah.
make more Bitcoin. There's not going to be more than
No.
21 million. So,
Good luck with
these
that.
are these are
You
exciting
know,
ideas.
yeah, no, they're going to have to buy it, and just kind of add about that, like you said about political necessity. So, I mean, governments who are running these large fiscal deficits, they need what? They need tax receipts. They need tax revenues. When Bitcoin before was purely, call it like an offshore thing, they probably had a hard time collecting taxes, off of it. But now that they've regulated it, essentially approve these ETFs like your ETF. Now they have the ability to tax it, potentially in a legitimate format. So now potentially, as Bitcoin continues to grow over time, that'll result in capital gains and its client portfolios, and they have the ability to tax it, which something that they would have had, like I said, a harder time doing in years past. It's difficult to believe that they would want to go back on that. Like if they have basically a means now to collect additional tax receipts over the next number of decades, why would they want to give that up? Essentially, even out of necessity. So that's something that kind of crossed my mind.
Yeah, totally agree.
Yeah. Last question. And this is directly for Elliot Johnson. Is Elliot Johnson a Bitcoin maximalist? Maximalist meaning that you think all of Elliot's money should be in Bitcoin, Are you a Bitcoin hodler, meaning that you like it, you don't think all your money should go into it, but whatever you have, you're not going to sell? Or is Elliot a Bitcoin trader, meaning that you understand these cycles quite well and you just can't resist the urge to trade it?
Wow, putting me on the spot here. I think if you asked my colleagues, they'd say I was a Bitcoin maxi because I
Yeah.
love talking about it. I'm definitely not a trader. I'm
Uh-huh.
definitely at least a hodler. Look, everybody's got a price. There's some price at which I guess I would sell some of
Sure.
my Bitcoin, but we're
Yeah.
not anywhere near that today. And I've been buying Bitcoin since it was $4,000 a coin. I've been through two significant bear market cycles, and I've only added to my position through the full cycle. And I'm so I that's my level of commitment to it. In terms of why I like my level of interest has grown over time as I've learned more about it. The more I've learned about it and the more I've seen where the world is going, the more I think it's critical for me to have a good allocation to it. Um, Nobody's going to buy my Bitcoin from me at $70,000. It's not close to where I would sell it at. Um, do I think I should have 100% of my assets in it? It's nowhere near 100% of my net worth,
Right.
not even
Yeah.
close. I don't think that's wise for anybody, but I am very comfortable having a sizable position in Bitcoin, and I'm very comfortable adding to it at these prices or even at higher prices because I don't think it gets riskier as time goes by. I
Right.
actually think on a risk adjusted basis, it's less risky today at $60,000 US
Yeah.
than it was at $4,000
Yes.
US.
I agree.
And
Yeah.
I think
Legitimizes
it'll
it.
be less risky again at 100,000. And so that, when you think of it that way, justifies a position that is growing as the price grows, because it becomes a safer asset because it's more regulated, more adopted, more people are using it, all the things that we've been talking about. So that's how I approach it. Um, do I wish I had bought more at four thousand
Oh, we
dollars?
all do.
Like, of course, but
Yeah. Same here. Yeah.
ask somebody who's owns Nvidia whether they wish they'd bought more Nvidia. We all have
Right.
these feelings
Yeah.
about our
Yeah. Yeah.
portfolios. That's
Yeah.
part of being an investor. And but I mean, there's no question that it's a core asset for me on a personal level, and obviously something I've got a keen interest in as well. Because the other side of it too, if I could just also say this, I think there are a lot of great people involved in Bitcoin. I feel like when you meet people who are into Bitcoin, interested in it, they tend to be the kind of people who are interested in the world becoming better. They tend to be optimistic
Yeah. I
people.
would agree.
They tend to be people
Yeah.
who have good feelings about the future and progress. And I really like that aspect of it as well.
No, I couldn't agree more on that regards. Elliot, thank you very much. This has been outstanding. And we're right at the end of the webinar, but just before we wrap up, is there any critical point that we missed that you can think of, or any critical slide that you wanted to go over? But otherwise, I think, we did quite a bit today.
No, I think I've covered it, everything that I wanted to chat about. I really appreciate the questions, and I would encourage any of your listeners, if they want to learn more, we do have a lot of resources on our website at evolveetfs.com. And obviously they should reach out to you. I think you're one of the best informed people in Bitcoin in the Canadian financial services industry,
Thank you.
and so I think there's an increasing number of resources to be had. I'd encourage people to, learn a little bit about it, talk to you about it, consider it for their financial plan, make sure that they're working with people where they can have access to it and think about it dispassionately. And if there's any questions for me, obviously people can get in touch with us through evolveetfs.com. And again, Peter, thank you to you also for inviting me on this webinar. I really enjoyed this conversation.
I enjoyed it as well. Thank you, Elliot. So once again, this is Elliot Johnson, CIO and COO of Evolve ETFs. This is, I believe, a very important webinar. More people, I believe, I think you believe as well, need to understand this. Not just investors, but also investment advisors and other portfolio managers. We're still in the early infancy stages of this, where although it's gaining lots of traction, I still believe most people don't really understand this. and they probably need to, or at least should, at least at some level. So learn, read up on it, educate yourself. There's tons of resources already available on the internet. There's resources available with Evolve ETFs. And if anybody has any questions, as always, please feel free to reach out to me directly, and I can guide them hopefully in the right direction to learn more about this. So Elliot, thank you very much. I really appreciate this.
Thank you.
Have a good night, everyone.